When Dr. Anthony Reed, a successful black surgeon, visits a small-town diner, he encounters blatant racism from a patron and later becomes the target of a prejudiced police officer who abuses his power to intimidate him. What begins as microaggressions quickly escalates into a series of shocking events, including false accusations and systemic bias, all designed to undermine Anthony's dignity and accomplishments. This gripping story highlights the infuriating reality of racism in America, the abuse of authority, and the uphill battle for accountability in a system designed to protect those who perpetuate prejudice. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the quiet streets of Grover's Hollow, a picturesque town nestled between rolling hills and dense pine forests. The kind of place where the barista at the local coffee shop knew your name and where strangers still waved to one another from across the road. It was charming, if not a bit insular, the sort of town where news traveled faster than a text message. Dr. Anthony Reed stepped out of his car, a sleek but understated sedan that barely hinted at his status. His pressed slacks and tailored shirt were impeccably neat, but not flashy. He moved with a quiet confidence, one that came from years of being at the top of his field without ever needing to boast about it. At 42, Anthony was one of the most respected neurosurgeons in the country, with accolades and published research that could have filled walls, but you'd never hear that from him. Instead, Anthony had always preferred to let his work speak for itself, though that humility sometimes made people underestimate him. Today was supposed to be a rare reprieve. He had driven an hour and a half from the city to visit Grover's Hollow at the request of his mother, who insisted that the small diner she'd frequented in her youth had the best peach cobbler this side of the Mississippi. Anthony chuckled at the thought as he pushed open the glass door of the diner, the overhead bell jingling softly. Inside, the diner was a blend of retro charm and small-town practicality. Vinyl booths, a long counter with spinning stools, and the faint hum of an old jukebox in the corner. The air smelled of freshly brewed coffee and fried chicken. A handful of patrons sat scattered across the booths, most of them older, sipping from mugs and chatting in low voices. Anthony made his way to a booth near the window, his broad shoulders and tall frame drawing a few curious glances. He offered a polite nod to those who looked his way, then slid into the booth. A young waitress approached him with a warm smile, her notepad already in hand. "Good afternoon," she said, her tone cheerful. "What can I get for you?" "Just coffee for now, thank you," Anthony replied, his deep voice measured but kind. The waitress nodded and quickly moved toward the counter. Anthony gazed out the window, taking in the quiet bustle of the street. It was moments like this that he cherished. Simple, unassuming, free from the weight of titles and expectations. But as the minutes passed, he couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in the atmosphere. A few patrons at nearby tables exchanged glances, their conversations quieting as they glanced his way. It wasn't overt, but it was familiar, a tension he had felt countless times before. Being a black man in a tailored shirt, an expensive watch in a place like this often elicited a particular kind of scrutiny, the kind that didn't need words to say, "You don't belong here." Anthony's coffee arrived, and he thanked the waitress with a small smile. She seemed unfazed, treating him like any other customer, which he appreciated. But as he reached for the sugar, a voice from a nearby booth cut through the quiet hum of the diner. "Funny seeing someone like that around here," the man said, his voice loud enough for Anthony to hear, but not so loud as to invite confrontation. His words were laced with an edge, the kind that was all too easy to pretend wasn't intended to offend. Anthony didn't look up right away, choosing instead to stir his coffee slowly. He had mastered the art of choosing his battles long ago. He wasn't about to give this man the satisfaction of a reaction, at least, not yet. "Must be lost," the man added with a chuckle. This time, Anthony glanced in the man's direction. He was middle-aged, with a beer belly spilling over his belt and a plaid shirt that strained at the buttons. His companion, a wiry man with a mustache, smirked but said nothing, letting his friend take the lead. Anthony held the man's gaze for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, as if dismissing him entirely, he turned back to his coffee. "Excuse me," a woman's voice interjected, breaking the awkward silence. Anthony looked up to see a young mother with 2 children in tow. Her face flushed as she approached the counter, addressing the waitress. "We've been waiting a while, is someone going to take our order?" The waitress, clearly frazzled, apologized and hurried over to the family. As the mother took her seat at a nearby booth, she caught Anthony's eye and offered a small, apologetic smile. He nodded politely in return. Anthony checked his watch. His mother had insisted on meeting him here, but she was running late, likely caught up at her church's community outreach program. While he waited, he considered pulling out his phone to check his emails, but decided against it. This was supposed to be a break, after all. Instead, he sipped his coffee and observed the quiet rhythms of the diner. The bell above the door jingled again, and a tall, sharp-featured man in a tailored blazer walked in. His presence immediately drew attention. Anthony recognized the type instantly. Confident, polished, someone used to commanding rooms without saying much. The man scanned the diner before his eyes landed on Anthony. With a slight nod of acknowledgement, he approached Anthony's table. "Dr. Reed?" he asked, extending a hand. Anthony shook it, his expression curious but cordial. "Yes, that's me. And you are?" "Evan Marshall," the man replied. "I'm with the local hospital. I heard you were in town, and I wanted to take the opportunity to speak with you." Anthony raised an eyebrow, surprised. "I wasn't aware I had a reputation in Grover's Hollow." Evan smiled, though there was something practiced about it. "Your reputation precedes you, Dr. Reed. I've followed your work for years. Your research on minimally invasive brain surgery is groundbreaking." Anthony nodded, his expression neutral. Compliments were common in his line of work, and while he appreciated genuine admiration, he had learned to be wary of flattery that came with ulterior motives. "Thank you," Anthony said. "How can I help you, Mr. Marshall?" "Well, to be honest," Evan began, lowering his voice slightly, "we've been struggling with retention in our surgical department, and I was hoping we could discuss a potential collaboration." Before Anthony could respond, the man in the plaid shirt from earlier piped up again, his tone mocking. "Looks like the big shot's got himself a fan club now," he said, leaning back in his seat. His companion chuckled nervously. Evan shot the man a disapproving glance, then turned back to Anthony. "Perhaps we could discuss this in a more private setting?" Anthony smiled faintly. "I'm happy to listen here. If nothing else, it's nice to know the diner offers good coffee and interesting conversation." The man in plaid scowled, clearly displeased with being indirectly dismissed, but Anthony didn't care. He gestured for Evan to continue, his attention fully focused now. As Evan began explaining his proposal, Anthony felt the weight of the room shift once again. The stares, the whispers. They were no longer just about his presence. There was a new tension brewing, one that hinted at the deeper undercurrents of resentment and entitlement simmering just below the surface. Anthony had seen it before. He knew the kind of people who couldn't stand to see someone like him in a position of authority, someone who shattered their narrow expectations. And as the afternoon wore on, he had the distinct feeling that today, in this unassuming diner, those tensions were about to boil over. Anthony listened as Evan elaborated on his proposal, the man's words flowing with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to selling big ideas. But Anthony's focus wasn't entirely on the conversation. His finely tuned instincts told him that the man in the plaid shirt and his companion weren't finished with their commentary. Sure enough, as Evan leaned forward to describe a staffing gap at the hospital, the man muttered something under his breath. It wasn't clear enough for Anthony to catch, but the companion's muffled laughter confirmed it wasn't complimentary. Anthony kept his face neutral, ignoring the distraction, but the slight tightening of his jaw betrayed his irritation. "Would you be open to visiting our facility before you leave town?" Evan asked, his tone hopeful. "Even a brief consultation could help us develop a plan moving forward." "I'll consider it," Anthony replied evenly. "I'll need more details about the situation first." Evan nodded, appearing encouraged. "Of course, I'll email you a summary tonight." As their conversation wrapped up, the waitress approached to refill Anthony's coffee. Her hand trembled slightly, spilling a few drops onto the table. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said, fumbling with a napkin. "It's fine," Anthony assured her with a small smile. He reached for his phone, intending to jot down a reminder about Evan's proposal, but the waitress lingered, her expression apologetic. Dr. Reed?" she said hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. I heard what that guy said earlier, and I wanted to say it's not how most folks here think." Anthony glanced up at her, his brow furrowing. Her genuine concern was evident, but it also confirmed that he hadn't misread the tension in the room. "Thank you," he said simply, appreciating her kindness, but knowing this was far from over. As the waitress hurried away, Evan excused himself with a handshake, promising to follow up. Soon Anthony settled back into his seat, sipping his coffee and letting his thoughts wander. He had grown used to situations like this, a mix of admiration and subtle resistance. It was the reality of being a black man in spaces where his success defied expectations. Still, it never failed to leave a bitter taste. The bell jingled again, and 2 police officers walked in, their uniforms crisp and their presence commanding. Anthony barely glanced their way until he noticed the man in plaid gesturing toward his table, his voice low but animated as he spoke to the officers. The officers listened intently, their eyes flicking toward Anthony before they nodded and approached. "Excuse me, sir," one of them said, his tone polite but firm. "Could we have a word?" Anthony set his coffee down, his stomach tightening. "Of course, is something wrong?" The officer, a stocky man with a graying beard, glanced at the man in plaid before responding. "We received a report of suspicious behavior. A patron mentioned you might be loitering or making others uncomfortable." Anthony's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression calm. "I see, and who made this report?" The officer hesitated, glancing back at the man in plaid, who sat with his arms crossed and a self-satisfied smirk. "That's not important right now. We just need to confirm you're here legitimately." Anthony took a slow breath, fighting the urge to let his frustration show. "I'm a paying customer," he said evenly. "I've ordered coffee, and I'm waiting for someone. If you'd like, I can show you the receipt." The second officer, a younger man with sharp features, frowned slightly. "That won't be necessary, sir. We're just following up on a concern." Anthony met his gaze, unblinking. "And what exactly was the concern?" The older officer shifted uncomfortably. "The patron mentioned you were acting suspiciously, like you were watching people or waiting for something." Anthony resisted the urge to laugh at the absurdity of the accusation. Instead, he reached into his pocket, moving deliberately so as not to alarm them, and pulled out his business card. "My name is Dr. Anthony Reed," he said, handing the card to the younger officer. "I'm a neurosurgeon, and I'm here waiting for my mother, who recommended this diner. If you'd like, I can call her to confirm." The younger officer examined the card, his brow furrowing. "Neurosurgeon." "Yes," Anthony said, his tone firm but polite. "Now, if there's nothing else, I'd like to finish my coffee." The older officer hesitated, his gaze flicking back to the man in plaid, who was now watching with barely concealed glee. After a moment, the officer nodded. "Apologies for the misunderstanding, Dr. Reed. Enjoy your afternoon." Anthony nodded curtly, watching as they returned to the counter. The younger officer seemed to be processing the interaction, his expression thoughtful, while the older one exchanged a few words with the man in plaid before heading back toward the door. Anthony's coffee had gone cold, but he didn't bother asking for a refill. He no longer had any appetite for peach cobbler or small-town charm. As he rose to leave, he noticed the waitress watching from the corner, her face pale with worry. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but he shook his head slightly, offering a faint smile to reassure her. He was halfway to the door when the man in plaid called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Guess it pays to have a fancy title, huh?" he sneered. "But you can't fool everybody." Anthony stopped in his tracks, turning slowly to face the man. His calm facade cracked just slightly, a flash of anger flickering in his eyes. "I don't need to fool anyone," he said, his voice steady but cutting. "And I certainly don't need your approval." The man's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered, leaning back in his seat. "Just saying, you don't look the part. Folks around here don't take kindly to liars." Anthony stepped closer, his imposing frame casting a shadow over the table. "And what part is that exactly? Because I don't see how enjoying a cup of coffee requires a costume." The diner fell silent, all eyes on the confrontation. The man's companion shifted uncomfortably, muttering something under his breath, but the man in plaid held his ground. "You know what I mean," he said, his voice lower but no less venomous. "People like you always think you're better than the rest of us." Anthony tilted his head, his expression calm but unyielding. "No," he said. I think people like me deserve the same respect as everyone else, but I see that's a hard concept for you to grasp." Before the man could respond, the older officer intervened, stepping between them. "All right, let's settle down here," he said, his tone brusque. "Sir, if you're leaving, I suggest you do so now." Anthony's gaze lingered on the man for a moment longer before he straightened, adjusting his cuffs. "Gladly." As he exited the diner, the bell jingling behind him, he felt a mix of anger and exhaustion settle in his chest. This wasn't new, it was just another example in a long line of moments where his identity was questioned, his presence challenged. But today, for some reason, it stung a little more. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the quiet street. Anthony leaned against his car for a moment, taking a deep breath to steady himself. He could feel the weight of the stairs from inside the diner, but he refused to let them see him falter. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out to see a message from his mother. "Running late, sweetheart. So sorry, I'll make it up to you next time." Anthony smiled faintly, typing out a quick response before sliding into the driver's seat. As he started the car, he glanced back at the diner one last time. The man in plaid was still sitting by the window, his smug expression visible even from a distance. Anthony shook his head and pulled onto the road, the tension slowly melting away as the diner faded in his rearview mirror. But the memory lingered, a reminder of how far society still had to go, and how often he would have to fight to claim the space he already deserved. The drive back to the city should have been uneventful. Anthony had planned to leave the tension of Grover's Hollow behind him, but the weight of the diner incident clung to him like smoke. As the setting sun dipped below the horizon, the air took on a crisp chill, and the narrow two-lane highway leading out of town was bathed in a dull amber glow. Anthony glanced in his rearview mirror and noticed the familiar flash of red and blue lights. His stomach tightened as the siren blared, signaling him to pull over. He let out a long breath, slowing his car to the shoulder. As he cut the engine, he watched the cruiser behind him, its headlights glaring in his rearview mirror. He hadn't been speeding. There was no reason for this stop, or so he thought. When the officer stepped out, Anthony recognized him immediately, the older cop from the diner. His gait was deliberate as he approached Anthony's window, his hand resting conspicuously on his holstered weapon. Anthony rolled down his window, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. "Evening, officer," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Is there a problem?" The officer tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "License and registration." Anthony reached slowly for his glove compartment, his movements measured to avoid any misunderstanding. "May I ask why I've been stopped?" "Just routine," the officer replied curtly, as though the explanation required no further elaboration. Anthony handed over his documents and sat back, watching as the officer examined them with a critical eye. The silence stretched uncomfortably long before the officer spoke again. "Dr. Reed, huh?" His tone was skeptical, as if the title didn't match the person sitting before him. "What brings you out here?" "Visiting family," Anthony replied evenly. "Family?" The officer leaned against the car, his posture casual, but his gaze sharp. "You know, we don't get too many folks like you driving cars like this through Grover's Hollow, just making sure everything checks out." Anthony bit back the sharp reply that rose to his lips. Instead, he met the officer's gaze steadily. "Am I being detained? Or am I free to go?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. The officer's jaw tightened slightly before he handed back Anthony's documents. "Watch yourself, Dr. Reed," he said, his voice carrying an edge of warning. "You wouldn't want any misunderstandings." With that, he stepped back, tapping the roof of the car twice as a signal to leave. Anthony's hands gripped the wheel tightly as he pulled back onto the road, his heart pounding. By the time Anthony reached the outskirts of the city, his nerves were frayed. He pulled into the underground parking garage of his high-rise condo and sat in his car for a moment, letting the tension drain from his shoulders. The soft hum of the city buzzed faintly above, a comforting reminder that he was back on familiar ground. He was about to head upstairs when his phone buzzed. The name on the screen made his stomach sink. Evan Marshall. Anthony swiped to answer. "Evan." "Dr. Reed." Evan's voice was tight, almost frantic. "I just got a call from someone in Grover's Hollow, a police officer. Apparently they're questioning whether you're..." credible. Anthony's pulse quickened. Questioning my credibility. On what grounds? They said you caused a disturbance at the diner, Evan continued. And that you were uncooperative during a traffic stop, Dr. Reed. I know this is nonsense, but it's causing ripples. The hospital board caught wind of it, and they're asking questions. Anthony's grip on the phone tightened. This is a baseless attack, Evan. You know that. I do, Evan said quickly. But the optics, you understand how these things can spiral. I'm trying to contain it, but you may need to get ahead of it. Anthony exhaled slowly, his mind racing. Let me handle it. The following day, Anthony's inbox was flooded with emails. Most were routine, but one caught his attention immediately. The subject line read, Urgent, Statement Request. It was from the hospital board, requesting an explanation regarding recent allegations of misconduct. Anthony's jaw tightened as he read the email. It was clear the situation was escalating faster than he'd anticipated. The small-town prejudice he'd faced in Grover's Hollow had followed him home, twisting facts to paint him as the aggressor. He decided to address it head-on. Picking up his phone, he called Mitchell Graves, his longtime colleague and friend, a trusted ally who had seen him navigate difficult situations before. Anthony, Mitchell said as he answered. I heard about what's happening. Are you okay? Anthony sighed. Frustrated mostly. It's the same story, different setting. They're trying to discredit me, and now the hospital board is involved. Mitchell's voice softened. What do you need from me? Support, Anthony said. They're going to want proof, evidence that I didn't do anything wrong. Can you help me get statements from the people who were there? The waitress? Maybe some of the other patrons? I'll see what I can do, Mitchell promised. But you know how this goes, they're going to dig for anything they can use against you. I know, Anthony said, his tone resolute. But I'm not letting them win. The next few days were a whirlwind. Anthony drafted a formal response to the hospital board, detailing the events at the diner and the traffic stop. He included character references and even provided a copy of his business card, emphasizing his credentials and professionalism. Mitchell had managed to contact the waitress, who agreed to write a statement corroborating Anthony's account. But even as Anthony worked to clear his name, the situation took another turn. A news article surfaced online with the headline, Prominent Surgeon Accused of Disturbance in Small Town. The article cited unnamed sources who claimed Anthony had been confrontational and disrespectful during his visit to Grover's Hollow. It was clear that someone, likely the officer or the man from the diner, had leaked a twisted version of the story to the press. The article spread quickly, and Anthony's phone buzzed relentlessly with calls and messages. Some were supportive, but others were far from kind. One voicemail, in particular, chilled him. You think you're better than us because of your fancy degrees and your big city job, the voice snarled. But you'll never belong. People like you don't get to walk into places like Grover's Hollow and act like you own it. Anthony played the message twice, his anger simmering. He had faced prejudice his entire life, but this felt different, more personal, more pointed. It wasn't just an attack on his character, it was a challenge to his right to exist in spaces he had every right to occupy. On the evening before the hospital board meeting, Anthony sat in his office, staring at the neatly organized folders on his desk. Evidence, statements, rebuttals, everything was meticulously prepared. But as he leaned back in his chair, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than him. He thought about the countless others who had faced similar battles, their accomplishments overshadowed by baseless accusations and systemic biases. He thought about the young waitress who had apologized for the behavior of her community, and the patrons who had averted their gazes, complicit in their silence. This wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about drawing a line in the sand, about refusing to let prejudice and entitlement dictate the narrative. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Mitchell. Got a call from someone at the diner. Might have more info for you. Call me. Anthony's resolve hardened. The next morning, he would walk into that boardroom prepared for a fight, and he wouldn't just defend himself. He would expose the truth for everyone to see. The boardroom at Lenox General Hospital was typically a place where progress was discussed. New hires, fundraising goals, expansions. But today, the air was thick with tension. Anthony sat at the long oak table, his neatly organized documents spread out before him. He was dressed impeccably, in a dark gray suit, his presence commanding despite the storm brewing around him. Across from him sat the hospital board members, a mix of executives, department heads, and legal advisors. At the head of the table was Margaret Lennox, the hospital's CEO, a steely-eyed woman in her late 50s, known for her no-nonsense demeanor. Her expression gave nothing away, but Anthony knew this meeting wasn't going to be an easy one. Mitchell sat to Anthony's right, his brow furrowed in quiet support. To his left, the hospital's legal counsel flipped through a thick file. A projector hummed softly, displaying the headline that had thrown Anthony's life into chaos. Prominent surgeon accused of disturbance in small town. Margaret cleared her throat. "Dr. Reed," she began, her tone calm but firm, "we've convened this meeting to address the allegations that have surfaced regarding your conduct in Grover's Hollow. While the board acknowledges your exemplary record, we cannot ignore the potential damage these claims may have on the hospital's reputation." Anthony nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "I understand, Ms. Lennox. And I've come prepared to address those claims." Margaret gestured toward the legal counsel, a wiry man named Thomas Grant. "Mr. Grant will outline the specifics of the situation before we proceed." Grant adjusted his glasses and opened a file. According to the report submitted by Officer Daniels of the Grover's Hollow Police Department, Dr. Reed engaged in behavior that could be interpreted as disruptive. The report alleges that he was uncooperative during a traffic stop and that his demeanor in the diner was perceived as intimidating to other patrons. Anthony's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Grant continued. "Additionally, an anonymous source claimed Dr. Reed made disparaging comments about the town and its residents. While we have not verified the credibility of these claims, their mere existence has created complications." Anthony leaned forward slightly. "Complications, Mr. Grant, arise when baseless accusations are given undue weight." Margaret raised a hand to quiet him. "You'll have your chance to respond, Dr. Reed. Let's keep this professional." Mitchell shifted in his seat, clearly restraining himself from speaking. Anthony gave him a subtle nod, signaling patience. Grant set down the file and folded his hands. "Dr. Reed, do you have any evidence to refute these claims?" Anthony pressed a button on the laptop before him, projecting a series of documents onto the screen. "I do first. I have a written statement from the waitress at the diner, confirming my behavior was entirely professional, despite the clear hostility I faced from another patron." He clicked again, displaying another document. "Second, I have a copy of the traffic stop footage obtained through a Freedom of Information request. It shows my complete compliance with the officer's instructions, as well as the officer's inappropriate comments about my presence in Grover's Hollow." The room fell silent as the footage played. The board members watched as Officer Daniels leaned against Anthony's car, his words dripping with barely concealed disdain. "You wouldn't want any misunderstandings." Margaret's expression tightened, but she said nothing. Anthony continued. "Third, I have evidence that the anonymous source who made those claims to the press is none other than the man who initiated the hostility in the diner. He has a history of filing false complaints, which I've detailed here." He handed a stack of papers to Grant, who flipped through them with increasing discomfort. Anthony leaned back, his voice steady but firm. "I am not here to cause problems for this hospital. I am here to clear my name, and more importantly, to ensure that incidents like this are recognized for what they are: attempts to undermine and discredit people who don't conform to certain expectations." Margaret steepled her fingers, her gaze sharp. "Dr. Reed, while your evidence is compelling, you must understand that perception often carries as much weight as fact. This situation has already attracted media attention, and the board is concerned about the potential fallout." Anthony's patience began to fray. "With all due respect, Ms. Lennox, this isn't about perception, it's about principle. If the hospital prioritizes avoiding controversy over standing by its staff, what message does that send?" Mitchell finally spoke up, his tone calm but pointed. "Anthony has built his reputation on excellence and integrity. If we cave to baseless accusations, we're not just failing him, we're failing the values this hospital claims to uphold." A few board members exchanged uneasy glances. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. Before anyone could respond, the door to the boardroom burst open, and a man strode in, his face flushed with indignation. It was Officer Daniels. "What is the meaning of this?" Margaret demanded, her voice cutting through the tension. Daniels held up a piece of paper. "I've just been informed that Dr. Reed filed a formal complaint against me and my department. You think you can come into my town and smear my name?" Anthony stood, his calm demeanor finally cracking. "Officer Daniels, this is a private meeting. You have no authority here." Daniels ignored him, turning to Margaret. "You should know what kind of man you're dealing with. He's out to ruin lives, mine included." Margaret stood, her voice icy. "Officer Daniels, if you don't leave this room immediately, I will call security." Daniels sneered. "Go ahead, but don't say I didn't warn you. People like him think they're untouchable because they've got a fancy degree and some money, but he's just like the rest of them, always playing the victim." Anthony's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay composed. He turned to the board. "This is exactly what I've been dealing with: baseless accusations, attempts to intimidate, and outright lies. If you can't see the pattern here, then perhaps the problem isn't just with Grover's Hollow." Margaret motioned to security, who escorted Daniels out of the room, his protests echoing down the hall. The tension in the room was palpable, but Anthony stood firm, his eyes meeting Margaret's. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice quieter now but no less resolute. "It's about every professional of color who has had to work twice as hard to prove they belong, only to have their accomplishments questioned the moment someone feels uncomfortable. I refuse to let this go unchallenged." Margaret studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Dr. Reed, the board will deliberate and provide a formal response by the end of the day. In the meantime, I suggest you prepare yourself for any outcome." Anthony nodded, gathering his documents. "I already have." Later that evening, as Anthony sat in his office, his phone buzzed. It was Mitchell. "You've got to see this," Mitchell said, his voice urgent. "Check your email." Anthony opened the attachment to find a video, footage from a patron at the diner. It captured the man in plaid berating Anthony, the officer's arrival, and Anthony's calm demeanor throughout the incident. The video had been posted online and was already gaining traction. "This changes everything," Mitchell said. "The truth is out there now." Anthony exhaled slowly, a flicker of hope sparking within him. But as he stared at the screen, his resolve hardened. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time, he felt the tide begin to turn. The hospital boardroom was silent, save for the faint hum of the projector still displaying the incriminating diner footage Mitchell had uncovered. Anthony stood tall at the end of the long table, his dark eyes fixed on Margaret Lennox across the table. The other board members shifted uncomfortably, their unease palpable. Outside the room, murmurs echoed as the chaos surrounding Officer Daniels' forced removal from the meeting buzzed through the hospital staff. Anthony's chest tightened, the weight of his career and reputation pressing down on him, but he didn't waver. Margaret cleared her throat, breaking the silence. "Dr. Reed, while this new evidence is compelling, we cannot ignore the potential damage to the hospital's public image. This situation has already garnered significant attention." Anthony arched a brow, his frustration boiling just beneath the surface. "With all due respect, Ms. Lennox, the attention isn't because of my actions. It's because of the systemic prejudice that allowed this to happen. And if the hospital takes the wrong side, it will only cement itself as complicit." Before Margaret could respond, the door to the boardroom swung open with a loud thud. Officer Daniels strode in, his face red with fury, flanked by two other men, one in uniform and the other in a suit. Daniels' eyes zeroed in on Anthony. "Dr. Reed," he spat, his voice venomous. "You've been busy." Margaret rose, her voice sharp. "Officer Daniels, you have no authority here. You've already disrupted this meeting once." Daniels ignored her, addressing the room. "I think you all need to know who you're dealing with. This man has been spreading lies about me, trying to ruin my career." Anthony stepped forward, his voice calm but cutting. "No one needed to ruin your career, officer. You've done that yourself." Daniels glared at him, the veins in his neck bulging. "You don't belong in places like Grover's Hollow, stirring up trouble and playing the victim. People like you always think you're better than the rest of us, but we see through the act." Anthony's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay composed. "Is that what you told yourself when you stopped me for no reason? When you made vague threats, hoping I'd shrink under your authority? Or when you colluded with a man at the diner to spread false accusations? Daniel's mouth twitched, his bluster faltering for a moment before he recovered. I don't have to explain myself to you. You're right, Anthony said, his voice rising slightly. But you will explain yourself to the law. From the far end of the table, Mitchell stood, holding up his phone. Officer Daniels, I think you'll find this interesting. He played the video from the diner, the audio clear as day. Daniels' dismissive tone, the man in plaid slurs, and Anthony's calm, measured responses. The board members leaned forward, their faces a mix of shock and discomfort as they watched the scene unfold. Daniel's expression darkened with every second of the footage, his confidence unraveling. And that's not all, Anthony said, pulling a folder from his briefcase. Officer Daniels, this isn't your first misconduct allegation, is it? In fact, there are at least 3 formal complaints on record against you for racial profiling. Daniel's face turned a deep shade of crimson. Those complaints were unfounded. Anthony held up a printed document, his voice unyielding. Were they? Because here's a statement from one of your former colleagues detailing your repeated targeting of black drivers in Grover's Hollow. And here's another, highlighting your habit of exaggerating charges to intimidate. The room buzzed with murmurs. Margaret held up a hand, silencing the chatter. Officer Daniels, she said, her voice icy. What do you have to say to these allegations? Daniels hesitated, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the evidence. His gaze darted to the suited man beside him, who had remained silent until now. The man in the suit cleared his throat, stepping forward. I'm Lieutenant Sanders, representing the Grover's Hollow Police Department. While Officer Daniels acted independently in some of these matters, I must emphasize that we take these allegations seriously. Anthony's eyes narrowed. Independently? So you're claiming his actions don't reflect the culture of your department? Sanders bristled. We can't be responsible for every decision made by... That's convenient, Anthony cut in, his voice sharp. Because these systemic failures don't happen in a vacuum, officer. Daniels didn't feel emboldened to act this way without the belief that his department would protect him. Margaret tapped her pen against the table, her expression unreadable. Lieutenant Sanders, are you prepared to address these issues within your department? Before Sanders could respond, Daniels erupted. This is a witch hunt. You're all taking his side because he's got a fancy title and knows how to play the race card. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Anthony stepped forward, his voice steady but brimming with quiet fury. This isn't about playing a card, Officer Daniels. This is about accountability. You abused your authority, tried to tarnish my reputation, and thought no one would challenge you. Well, here I am. Daniels opened his mouth to retort, but Sanders held up a hand, silencing him. Enough, Sanders said, his tone firm. He turned to Margaret. The department will investigate Officer Daniels's conduct. In the meantime, he will be placed on administrative leave. Daniels's face twisted in anger. You can't do this. Actually, they can, Anthony said coldly. And they should have done it a long time ago. Daniels lunged forward, his rage boiling over. You think this is over? You think you've won? 2 security guards stepped into the room, intercepting him before he could get closer to Anthony. As they escorted him out, his shouts echoed down the hallway. This isn't over! You'll regret this! The boardroom remained tense, the weight of the confrontation hanging heavy in the air. Margaret broke the silence, her tone measured. Dr. Reed, the board will review everything you've presented and reconvene tomorrow to discuss next steps. Anthony nodded. I expect nothing less. That evening, Anthony sat in his office, his thoughts racing. The confrontation had been cathartic, but the fight wasn't over. Daniel's outburst had exposed the depths of his hatred, but it also highlighted the larger issue at hand, a system that allowed people like him to thrive unchecked. Mitchell entered the office, a bottle of bourbon in hand. Thought you might need this? Anthony chuckled, accepting the glass Mitchell poured. Thanks. Mitchell sat across from him, his expression thoughtful. You handled yourself well today. Not many people would have kept their cool. Anthony swirled the bourbon in his glass, his gaze distant. Cool doesn't win fights, Mitchell's strategy does. Mitchell nodded, raising his glass in a silent toast. To strategy, then. Anthony smiled faintly, clinking his glass against Mitchell's. As he sipped the bourbon, a new thought took root. The battle with Daniels wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about setting a precedent. It was about ensuring that the next person targeted by prejudice and corruption wouldn't have to fight alone. And as the city lights twinkled outside his window, Anthony resolved to do just that. The sterile silence of the courtroom carried a gravity that Anthony had long prepared himself for. Rows of spectators filled the gallery, their whispers dying down as the bailiff called the room to order. Officer Daniels sat at the defendant's table, his broad frame hunched and his jaw clenched tightly. He looked every bit the cornered predator, defiant and seething. Anthony, seated with his legal counsel at the plaintiff's table, exuded a quiet calm. His tailored suit was sharp, his posture straight, and his hands clasped on the table before him. But beneath the polished exterior, his resolve burned like a steady flame. This wasn't just about Daniels anymore, it wasn't even about Grover's Hollow. The stakes were broader now, the room heavy with the symbolic weight of countless similar injustices. The judge, a wiry man with silver-framed glasses, entered the room, his gavel striking with a sharp crack. This court is now in session proceeding, Reed versus Daniels. The plaintiff's attorney, Elise Monroe, stood. First, Elise was a seasoned litigator, with an air of confidence that filled the room as she approached the bench. "Your Honor," she began, "today we present evidence that not only proves Officer Daniels' misconduct, but also highlights a troubling pattern of systemic abuse and corruption within his department." Daniels' lawyer, a stout man named Garrett Clay, immediately rose in protest. "Your Honor, the plaintiff is overreaching. This is about one incident, not a systemic critique." Elise didn't flinch. "The evidence we will present is directly tied to this incident. It paints a broader picture of how systemic prejudice enabled Officer Daniels to act with impunity." The judge adjusted his glasses, considering her words. "I'll allow it. Proceed." Elise nodded, returning to the plaintiff's table. She leaned in, her voice low but steady. "It's time, Anthony." Anthony stood, his commanding presence drawing the attention of everyone in the room. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him, but he pushed down any lingering nerves he had prepared for this. "Your Honor," he began, his voice calm but resolute, "I am here not just as a victim of Officer Daniels's actions, but as a representative of every individual who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong. What happened in Grover's Hollow wasn't an isolated incident, it was the culmination of a pattern of behavior fueled by unchecked power and prejudice." Daniels' face reddened, his hands gripping the edge of the defense table. Anthony ignored him, turning his attention back to the judge. "To prove this," Anthony continued, "we will show a series of events that highlight how Officer Daniels not only targeted me, but used his authority to perpetuate systemic harm." Elise clicked a button on the projector, and the first piece of evidence appeared. The diner footage Mitchell had uncovered. The video played in silence. The room riveted as the antagonistic exchange between Anthony and the man in plaid unfolded. Then came the arrival of Daniels, his condescension and veiled threats unmistakable. The video ended, and murmurs rippled through the gallery. Elise clicked again, this time pulling up the footage from the traffic stop. The room tensed as Daniels' words played back. "You wouldn't want any misunderstandings." "Officer Daniels' tone and conduct speak for themselves," Elise said. "But that's not all." She placed a thick folder on the bench, addressing the judge. "This file contains prior complaints against Officer Daniels for racial profiling, many of which were swept under the rug by his department. Your Honor, this is not just about a rogue officer, it's about a system that protected and enabled him." Garrett Clay rose, his voice booming. "Objection! This is character assassination. My client's past conduct is irrelevant to the specific charges at hand." The judge frowned, tapping his gavel lightly. "Overruled." "The plaintiff may continue." Anthony glanced at Elise, who nodded. It was time to take control of the narrative. He stood again, addressing the room directly. "When Officer Daniels stopped me on the road that evening, I knew I was being targeted, not for anything I did, but for who I am. When he walked into that diner, his actions weren't about enforcing the law, they were about asserting power, about sending a message that people like me don't belong." Daniels slammed his hand on the table, his voice loud and biting. "People like you. What does that even mean? Don't act like some kind of saint. You were looking for trouble the second you walked into that town." The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. The judge slammed his gavel. "Officer Daniels, control yourself," Daniels sneered, his composure cracking under the pressure. "This whole thing is a setup. He thinks he's better than everyone else because he's got a degree and some money, but I see through it. It's all for show." Anthony's jaw tightened, but he refused to let Daniels' outburst rattle him. Instead, he turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I believe Officer Daniels has just revealed the crux of this case. His actions weren't motivated by law or order, they were motivated by prejudice." Elise stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise. "Your Honor, the plaintiff rests. The evidence speaks for itself." The courtroom emptied hours later, leaving only Anthony, Elise, and Mitchell to review the day's proceedings. The tension lingered in the air, but there was a growing sense of momentum. Anthony's calm demeanor throughout the trial had contrasted starkly with Daniels's unraveling composure, tipping the scales in Anthony's favor. "That was a masterclass," Mitchell said, clapping Anthony on the back. "You kept your cool while he practically self-destructed." Elise nodded. "The jury saw the real Daniels today. That was the turning point." Anthony exhaled slowly, the weight of the confrontation settling in. "It's not over yet, but I'm ready for whatever comes next." The final day of the trial brought a packed courtroom, the gallery overflowing with reporters, activists, and curious onlookers. Anthony felt the buzz of anticipation as he took his seat, the enormity of the moment pressing down on him. The defense called Daniels to the stand, a desperate attempt to salvage what was left of their case. Garrett Clay's questions were rehearsed, his tone coaxing as he tried to paint Daniels as a dedicated officer doing his job. But when Elise stood for cross-examination, the tone shifted. "Officer Daniels," she began, her voice sharp and precise. "Do you deny targeting Dr. Reed because of his race?" Daniels glared at her. "I treated him like I'd treat anyone else." "So you routinely fabricate reports and intimidate civilians?" Elise asked, raising an eyebrow. "Is that part of your standard procedure?" Daniels fumbled, his bravado cracking. "That's not what I meant." Elise pressed on. "Isn't it true, Officer Daniels, that you referred to Dr. Reed as people like him in this very courtroom? And isn't it true that you have a documented history of racial bias?" Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The courtroom watched as his confidence drained away, replaced by a palpable sense of defeat. Elise turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about more than one man's misconduct. It's about a system that allowed it to happen, but today, you have the power to say enough." As the jury deliberated, Anthony sat in the courthouse lobby, his mind racing. He thought of the long road that had led him here, the countless moments of restraint and perseverance that had brought him to this point. When the verdict finally came, Anthony stood tall as the foreperson read the decision. In favor of the plaintiff. The weight of the words washed over him, a mixture of relief, validation, and renewed purpose. But as he stepped out of the courthouse into the bustling street, he knew this wasn't the end. It was a beginning, a chance to challenge the systems that had tried to silence him and to pave the way for others to do the same. The courthouse steps were alive with energy. Reporters swarmed the entrance, their cameras flashing as they shouted questions at Anthony. Despite the chaos, Anthony held his head high, his posture calm and dignified. Elise stood beside him, a satisfied smile tugging at the corners of her mouth, while Mitchell hovered protectively nearby, ready to shield him from the media frenzy. A reporter thrust a microphone forward. "Dr. Reed, how do you feel about today's verdict?" Anthony paused, the gravity of the moment settling over him. "Today was about more than one man's actions," he said, his voice steady but resolute. "It was about accountability, and shining a light on the systems that enable prejudice. I'm grateful for the jury's decision, but the work doesn't stop here." The reporters pressed for more, their voices overlapping in a flurry of questions, but Anthony held up a hand. "Thank you," he said simply, before turning to walk away. Elise and Mitchell flanked him as they moved through the crowd, leaving the reporters clamoring behind them. Holding power accountable. The fallout for Officer Daniels was swift and decisive. The Grover's Hollow Police Department announced an internal investigation into his conduct, and within days, Daniels was officially dismissed from the force. His history of misconduct, once buried beneath layers of bureaucratic protection, was now a matter of public record. The town's mayor, facing mounting pressure from the media and local activists, called for a review of the department's practices. A third-party oversight committee was brought in, tasked with addressing the systemic issues that had allowed Daniels' behavior to persist for so long. Anthony read the headlines with a mix of satisfaction and cautious optimism. Daniels had been held accountable, but Anthony knew this was just the beginning. Real change would require more than one man's downfall. It would require a collective effort to dismantle the systems that propped him up. The community reacts back at Lenox General Hospital. Anthony's colleagues greeted him with a newfound respect. Many of them had followed the case closely, their initial skepticism replaced with admiration for his courage. A few even approached him to share their own stories of facing prejudice, their voices hesitant but grateful. "I didn't think someone like me could ever speak up," one nurse admitted, her voice trembling. "But watching you fight, it's given me hope." Anthony smiled warmly. "It's not easy, but it's worth it, and you don't have to do it alone." Word of the case spread beyond the hospital, sparking conversations in boardrooms, classrooms, and community centers across the city. Activists reached out to Anthony, inviting him to speak at events and share his story. Though the spotlight was unfamiliar, Anthony saw it as an opportunity to amplify the voices of others who had been silenced. Personal growth. At home, in the quiet of his apartment, Anthony allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The man who had walked into Grover's Hollow that day was not the same man who now stared back at him in the mirror. The ordeal had tested his patience, his resilience, and his belief in justice, but it had also reaffirmed his purpose. Anthony had always believed in the power of his work as a surgeon, in the lives he changed one patient at a time. But now, he understood that his impact could extend beyond the operating room. He could use his platform, his voice, to challenge the systemic barriers that stifled progress and perpetuated inequality. It wasn't just about clearing his name anymore, it was about ensuring that no one else would have to endure what he had. Rebuilding bridges. Anthony knew that healing often required returning to the source of pain. A week after the verdict, he found himself back in Grover's Hollow. The streets felt quieter, the air heavier, as if the town itself was grappling with the weight of recent events. He entered the diner, the bell above the door jingling softly. The waitress who had written the statement for his case looked up, her eyes widening in recognition. "Dr. Reed?" she said, her voice laced with both surprise and relief. "I didn't think you'd ever come back." Anthony smiled gently. "I wanted to thank you for standing up when it mattered." The waitress flushed, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her apron. "I just did what was right. You did the hard part." Anthony nodded, his gaze sweeping the diner. A few patrons avoided his eyes, their discomfort evident, but others offered tentative smiles or polite nods, small gestures that hinted at the town's slow reckoning with itself. Before leaving, Anthony slid a generous tip across the counter. "For the cobbler," he said with a wink, eliciting a laugh from the waitress, a ripple effect. Anthony's case became a catalyst for change far beyond Grover's Hollow. The video of Daniels's behavior went viral, sparking a national conversation about racial bias and abuse of power. Activists and lawmakers cited the case as evidence of the urgent need for police reform, using Anthony's story as a rallying cry for accountability. At Lenox General, the hospital board announced new initiatives to address diversity and inclusion. Inspired by Anthony's courage, Margaret Lennox herself approached Anthony one evening, her tone uncharacteristically warm. "Dr. Reed," she said, extending a hand, "you've reminded us all of the values this institution was built on. Thank you." Anthony accepted the handshake, his expression thoughtful. "The real test will be what we do moving forward." Margaret nodded, her gaze steady. "Agreed." New horizons. Though the battle had been exhausting, Anthony found himself energized by the possibilities ahead. He accepted an invitation to speak at a national conference on equity in healthcare, sharing his experiences and calling for systemic change. His speech was met with a standing ovation, the audience moved by his determination and clarity. As he stepped off the stage, Elise approached him, her eyes sparkling with pride. "You're a natural," she said. "Ever thought about a career in advocacy?" Anthony chuckled. "One battle at a time, Elise." Lingering challenges. Despite the victories, Anthony knew the fight was far from over. Daniel's supporters continued to spread misinformation, painting him as a victim of cancel culture. Anonymous threats trickled in, a reminder of the deep-seated resistance to change, but Anthony refused to be deterred. He had faced worse, and emerged stronger. The challenges ahead only reaffirmed his commitment to the cause. A quiet triumph. One evening, Anthony sat on the balcony of his apartment, the city lights stretching out before him. A soft breeze rustled the leaves of a nearby tree, carrying with it a sense of calm he hadn't felt in months. His phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Mitchell. "You're making waves, my friend. Proud of you." Anthony smiled, typing a quick response before setting the phone aside. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to simply be. The battles would continue. But for now, he could rest. As he sipped his tea, Anthony reflected on how far he had come, not just through this ordeal, but in life. He had faced prejudice, doubt, and adversity, yet he had risen each time, stronger and more resolved. And now, as the city hummed softly around him, he felt ready for whatever came next. As Anthony Reed sat at his desk one quiet evening, the events of the past few months replayed in his mind. He had been tested in ways he never anticipated, forced to confront not just the prejudice of a single man, but the insidious systems that allowed such prejudice to thrive. Yet here he was, still standing, still resolute, and perhaps most importantly, still hopeful. For Anthony, the confrontation with Officer Daniels and the subsequent trial had become more than just a fight to clear his name. It was a battle for dignity, for accountability, and for the principle that no one should be diminished because of who they are. And though the journey had been grueling, it had also been transformative. Before the ordeal, Anthony had prided himself on his ability to rise above adversity with quiet dignity. He had built his career on excellence, believing that hard work and professionalism could shield him from prejudice. But Grover's Hollow had shattered that illusion. It had forced him to reckon with the reality that success and respectability were not enough to erase centuries of systemic bias. Through that reckoning, Anthony found a new kind of strength, not the quiet resilience of someone enduring injustice, but the fiery resolve of someone determined to challenge it. Personal growth and transformation. The experience had sharpened Anthony's understanding of his own identity and purpose. He was no longer content to simply navigate the systems that sought to marginalize him. He wanted to change them. This shift was evident not only in his professional life, but also in how he carried himself. Anthony had learned to use his voice with precision and power. He no longer hesitated to call out injustice, whether it was a subtle microaggression in a boardroom or a blatant abuse of authority. But he had also learned the importance of collaboration, of finding allies like Elise, Mitchell, and the countless others who had supported him during his fight. In reflecting on his journey, Anthony realized that his greatest strength lay in his ability to inspire others. By standing up for himself, he had encouraged others to do the same. The nurse who confided in him about her own experiences with discrimination, the young waitress in Grover's Hollow who risked backlash to support his case, the colleagues who had been emboldened to speak out against systemic inequities within the hospital. All of these moments reminded Anthony that change was not a solitary pursuit, but a collective effort. Broader implications and systemic change. Anthony's case had reverberated far beyond Grover's Hollow. The viral diner video and the courtroom confrontation had sparked a national conversation about accountability, privilege, and the abuse of power. Advocacy groups used his story as a rallying cry, pushing for police reform and broader systemic changes. His name had become synonymous with courage and perseverance, but Anthony was careful to remind others that his story was just one of many. The case also shed light on the complicity of institutions. The Grover's Hollow Police Department's long history of ignoring misconduct was not unique. It was a reflection of a larger entrenched problem. Anthony's victory had forced the department to address its failings, but it also highlighted the need for vigilance and sustained pressure. Reform, he knew, was not a one-time event, but a continuous process. At Lenox General Hospital, The ripple effects of Anthony's fight were equally profound. The board's initial reluctance to back him had sparked introspection, leading to a renewed commitment to diversity and equity. Anthony had been invited to join a task force dedicated to addressing systemic bias within the healthcare system, a challenge he accepted with a mix of determination and humility. A call to action. For Anthony, the most significant lesson of his journey was the importance of collective action. His struggle had reminded him that no one succeeds alone, and that progress requires both individual courage and communal effort. He had been fortunate to have allies like Elise and Mitchell, but he also recognized the contributions of strangers, the bystanders who recorded the diner incident, the activists who amplified his story, and the jurors who chose justice over convenience. Anthony often thought about what he wanted others to take away from his experience. He hoped his story would inspire people to speak out against injustice, even when it was uncomfortable or inconvenient. He wanted them to see that change was possible, not because of any one person's actions, but because of the collective power of individuals united by a shared purpose. But Anthony also understood that hope alone wasn't enough. Real progress required sustained effort, uncomfortable conversations, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. He wanted people to see the complexity of the fight, not as a reason to despair, but as a reminder of the resilience required to achieve meaningful change. Emotional closure and looking forward. Despite the progress Anthony had helped ignite, he knew the road ahead would not be easy. The backlash against him had been vocal and vicious, a reminder of how deeply some clung to their prejudices. Anonymous messages accusing him of playing the race card continued to trickle in, and Daniel's supporters framed the case as an overreach, a supposed attack on good officers. But Anthony refused to let the negativity deter him. He had faced worse and emerged stronger. He had seen firsthand the power of truth, of resilience, and of solidarity. And he knew that for every detractor, there were countless others who had been inspired by his fight. One evening, as Anthony walked through his neighborhood, he spotted a group of teenagers gathered at a community center. They were listening intently as a young woman spoke about organizing for justice. Anthony stopped to watch, his heart swelling with pride. It reminded him that the fight for equality wasn't just his fight, it was a movement, one that spanned generations and communities. The young woman noticed him and smiled. "Dr. Reed," she said, walking over to shake his hand, "you're the reason I started doing this, thank you." Anthony shook her hand firmly, his voice warm but serious. "The work you're doing is the reason this fight continues. Keep going." As he walked away, Anthony felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in months. The events of Grover's Hollow would always be a part of his story, but they didn't define him. What defined him was his unwavering commitment to justice, his belief in the power of community, and his refusal to be silenced. The final reflection. Sitting on his balcony that night, Anthony gazed out at the city lights, a steaming cup of tea in his hands. He thought about how far he had come, not just in the past few months, but in his life. From the young boy who had been told to know his place, to the man who had stood before a courtroom and demanded respect, Anthony had carved his own path, but he also knew his journey wasn't over. There were still battles to fight, systems to challenge, and minds to change. And Anthony was ready. As the cool evening breeze brushed against his skin, Anthony allowed himself a small smile. The world was far from perfect, but it was moving, however slowly, toward something better. And as long as there were people willing to stand up and fight, there was hope. Anthony took a deep breath, his resolve renewed. Whatever came next, he would face it head-on, with courage, with grace, and with the unshakable belief that justice was worth fighting for.